Have you ever been judged before you even had a chance to speak? Imagine sitting quietly on a plane, seatbelt fastened, book in hand, only to be accused of causing turbulence you never created. What would you do if the very people sworn to protect your safety turned against you, treating you as the problem instead of the passenger? This is the story of Celeste Johnson, a woman of grace and power, who in one moment was humiliated before strangers, and in the next was forced to choose surrender her dignity, or stand up against a system built on silence and bias. And here's the question we all must face if it were you in that seat. Would you shrink into silence, or hold your ground, knowing the world was watching tonight? We invite you to step into Celeste's journey, not just a story of injustice, but of courage, redemption, and a storm that shook an entire industry awake. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Because stories like this remind us the fight for dignity belongs to us all. The morning sun poured through the wide glass windows of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, casting long golden stripes across the polished floor. Travelers shuffled along, dragging carry-ons, clutching coffee cups, and checking their phones for gate updates. It was a scene so ordinary that no one would have guessed something extraordinary was about to unfold. Celeste Johnson walked calmly through the terminal, her heels clicking softly on the tile. At 44, she carried herself with the composure of a woman who had weathered storms, both personal and professional. Her tailored navy blazer and crisp ivory blouse spoke of quiet authority, but it was the way she moved measured, unhurried, that drew attention without demanding it. In her hand, she carried a leather-bound journal, its corners softened from years of use. Inside were pages filled with ideas, reflections, even prayers written during moments of turbulence in her own life. That journal was her constant travel companion, a reminder that even at 30,000 feet, she could carve out stillness. The announcement over the loudspeaker called for boarding of Flight 237 nonstop service from Dallas to New York. Celeste approached the gate with her boarding pass and ID ready. The gate agent scanned the ticket, glanced at her, and then offered a brief nod before waving her through. No problem there. She stepped into the jet bridge, welcomed by the familiar hum of recycled air and distant engine whine. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was just beginning to fill. Passengers arranged their bags, adjusted seats, scrolled through phones. A businessman argued into his Bluetooth headset about quarterly numbers. A young couple snapped selfies, whispering excitedly about their first trip to New York. Celeste slid gracefully into seat 2B by the window. She placed her journal on her lap, clicked her pen, and began to write. The opening words flowed as naturally as her breathing. Above the clouds, the world always feels paused, as if time itself allows you to listen again. Writing calmed her, reminded her who she was when the world tried to say otherwise. For a few minutes, the cabin hummed with ordinary life. A flight attendant offered sparkling water. Celeste accepted with a warm thank you. She adjusted her seatbelt, tucked a loose curl of hair behind her ear, and let herself exhale. It was rare for her phone to be silent, for emails to stop pinging, for demands not to pull her in 10 directions at once. Flying, for Celeste, was less about travel and more about reclaiming stillness. But even stillness can be fragile. From the corner of her eye, Celeste noticed another flight attendant. This one was tall, slim, with sharp features and an expression that seemed carved in stone. Her nameplate read, Linda Matthews. Linda's gaze lingered on Celeste for just a beat too long. It wasn't the glance of someone making sure a passenger was comfortable. It was a searching look, like she was questioning something that didn't need questioning at all. Celeste had seen that look before on sidewalks, in department stores, at hotel check-in counters, a look that seemed to whisper, "Do you belong here?" She knew better than to react. Instead, she lowered her eyes to her journal and kept writing. The engines roared to life, and the plane rolled away from the gate. Soon, the nose lifted, and Dallas shrank into a patchwork of roads and rooftops. Clouds gathered below like an endless cotton field. Celeste leaned back, letting her pen pause. Flying always reminded her of possibility of how far she had come from a childhood where every penny mattered, where her mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Now she was here, a CEO in her own right, heading to New York for a series of meetings that could shape the future of her company. Yet she traveled without entourage or fanfare, just her thoughts, and the sky. For the first 20 minutes, the ride was smooth. The overhead lights glowed softly. A faint aroma of coffee drifted through the cabin. Celeste sipped her water and scribbled a few more lines in her journal. Then, just as she began to relax, the first bump hit. The fuselage rattled lightly. A few passengers gasped, and the businessman across the aisle muttered something about turbulence. Celeste steadied her pen, unconcerned. Turbulence was nothing new. But what unsettled her wasn't the bump in the air, it was Linda. The attendant passed down the aisle, her eyes flicking toward Celeste again, lingering with that same assessing weight. She paused at Celeste's row, tilted her head, and forced a tight smile. "Is everything all right?" Ma'am Linda asked. Celeste blinked, slightly confused. "Yes." "Why do you ask?" Linda's eyes swept from Celeste's tailored suit to the glint of her silver wristwatch before settling on her face. "You seemed uneasy." "Just checking if you're comfortable." The words were polite, but the tone was sharp, condescending. Celeste knew what was really being implied, that somehow her presence in seat 2B was unsettling, that she might not belong in this cabin of leather seats and poured wine. She smiled politely, masking the irritation that bubbled beneath. "I'm perfectly fine." "Thank you." Linda hesitated for a second longer, as if searching for a flaw in the answer. Finally, she turned away, her shoes clicking briskly against the aisle as she disappeared into the galley. Celeste closed her journal and exhaled. She had faced these moments all her life, moments when dignity had to be worn like armor. Yet something about this glance, this tone, lingered heavier than usual. She could feel a storm gathering, though the skies outside showed only a scattering of white. For now, she chose stillness again. She tucked her pen into the spine of her journal, rested her hands gently on the leather cover, and gazed out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly, soft and calm. From above, they looked like peace. From within, she felt the rumblings of something else entirely. What Celeste didn't know, what no one on Flight 237 knew, was that the turbulence that mattered wouldn't come from the sky. It would come from prejudice. And before this flight was over, that prejudice would crash head-on with power. The cabin had settled into a fragile calm after takeoff, the kind of quiet filled with clicking seatbelts and the faint rustle of magazines. But for Celeste Johnson, that quiet carried undertones. She felt the shift, like a string pulled too tight, though no one else seemed to notice. She glanced around the cabin. The businessman across the aisle was still locked in his conference call, his voice loud enough for everyone in rows 1 through 3 to know he was not impressed with last quarter's sales. 2 rows back, a young mother whispered to her daughter, distracting the girl with a coloring book. At first glance, it was the ordinary mix of travelers, executives, families, couples, dreamers heading toward New York. Yet every so often, Celeste caught eyes flicking toward her, not openly hostile, just curious, questioning. Linda Matthews, the flight attendant with the clipped smile, reappeared down the aisle carrying a tray of drinks. Her heels tapped briskly against the carpet, her posture straight as if she were balancing something invisible on her shoulders. She stopped at row 1, bending graciously to offer champagne. Laughter bubbled from the couple seated there. But when Linda reached Celeste's row, her tone shifted. "Would you like something to drink?" "Ma'am." The pause before ma'am stretched just long enough to sting. Celeste gave the same polite smile she had offered countless times in boardrooms when someone underestimated her. "Sparkling water is fine." Linda poured the drink, her eyes lingering on Celeste's hands as though searching for a clue. Was she wealthy enough, refined enough, belonging enough? Celeste had long ago learned to read those questions without a single word being spoken. As Linda moved on, the man seated in 2A, a silver-haired gentleman in his 60s, leaned slightly towards Celeste. His cologne carried hints of cedar and musk. "Don't take it personal," he murmured. "These flight attendants, they're just doing their jobs." Celeste turned her head slowly to meet his gaze. His eyes were pale blue, kind perhaps, but his words carried the familiar tone of dismissal. She chose her reply carefully. "Doing their jobs doesn't require doubting who I am," she said quietly. The man blinked, surprised, then offered a sheepish chuckle. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," Celeste answered softly, turning back to her window. But the conversation replayed in her mind, each word a reminder that bias often wore the mask of casualness. The plane rattled gently again, the first whisper of turbulence. Passengers stiffened, some clutching armrests, though it was nothing unusual. Celeste had flown often enough to know when there was cause for concern. This was not it. Yet she noticed Linda disappear into the cockpit for a longer stretch than seemed necessary. When she returned, her lips were pursed, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as they swept across Celeste's seat. Celeste shifted in her chair, pressing her palms against her journal as if anchoring herself. She had promised her mother years ago she would never let anger be her first response. Her mother's voice still echoed in memory. "They'll come for you with looks, with words, with silence. But you hold your ground. Celeste, you stand with dignity." The minutes ticked on. Another round of turbulence jolted the cabin, this one stronger. A few gasps rippled through the air. A flight attendant reassured passengers in economy, reminding them to fasten belts. In first class. Linda returned, kneeling beside row 1, her voice low but audible. "It seems the lady in 2B is disturbing other passengers," Linda said. Celeste's breath caught. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken above a whisper. Yet here it was, an accusation forming out of thin air. She resisted the urge to speak, listening instead. The woman in row 1 shrugged. "I didn't hear anything." But the businessman across the aisle rolled his eyes dramatically. "She's been shifting around. Some people just can't sit still." Celeste turned to look at him. He met her gaze briefly, then smirked as if pleased to have drawn a reaction. Linda straightened, her expression neutral, but her eyes glittered with quiet confirmation, as though she had gathered enough evidence to bring forward. She strode back toward the galley with purpose. Celeste's heart tightened. She could feel the narrative being woven without her, a turbulence not of air, but of assumptions. The young man seated 2 rows back, Daniel Kim, shifted uncomfortably. He pulled out his phone, angling it casually as though scrolling, but the camera lens peaked above the seat in front of him. He had seen enough already to know something was off. His hands trembled, but he pressed record. Celeste stared at the blank page of her journal, her pen hovering. Words refused to come. What could she write? That even at 30,000 feet, she was not free from being questioned, that a lifetime of achievements meant little in the face of suspicion. Her mind wandered back to her childhood again. to a sixth-grade classroom in Houston, where her teacher accused her of cheating on a math test because her answers were too advanced. She remembered the sting, the humiliation, and the way her mother walked into that school the next morning, head high, voice calm, yet firm. "My daughter is capable," her mother had declared. "Don't you dare shrink her brilliance to fit your expectations." Celeste had promised herself that day she would never shrink. Yet here she was, decades later, a CEO with influence and wealth, still sitting under the shadow of the same question. "Do you belong here?" The intercom crackled, jolting her back. Captain Thomas Green's voice came through, deep and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." His words were standard procedure, but moments later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Green himself stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, with the presence of someone used to commanding. His eyes swept the first-class cabin before landing squarely on Celeste. The silence was heavy, expectant. He pointed directly at her. "You, ma'am, you've been causing disruption. We've had complaints." The words hung in the air like a slap. Celeste's lips parted, but for a second no sound came out. She had been silent nearly the entire flight. She had disturbed no one. Yet here was authority uniform, stripes, title-levying accusation with certainty. She drew a slow breath. "Captain, I've done nothing but sit in my seat." His jaw tightened. "Passengers' comfort and safety are my responsibility. If you cannot remain calm, we'll have to remove you upon landing." Gasps rippled among the passengers. Some turned away, unwilling to be involved. Others watched with quiet fascination, as though witnessing a spectacle. The businessman across the aisle smirked again. Celeste held the captain's gaze. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She spoke the words her heart demanded. "I am sitting in my rightful seat. I am not moving." Her voice was calm, but beneath it flowed generations of defiance. Every ancestor who had been told to move, to yield, to know their place. The captain's expression hardened. "We'll see about that." He turned sharply and strode back into the cockpit, the door locking with a mechanical click behind him. The tension in the cabin thickened. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others buried themselves in phones or magazines. Only Daniel Kim kept his phone raised just enough to capture it all. His pulse racing as he realized he was recording more than a flight. He was recording injustice. Celeste placed her journal back on the tray table, her hand steady though her chest burned. She whispered inwardly, "A prayer, or perhaps a vow. This ends differently. Not this time." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane pushed deeper into its journey. Outside, clouds gathered like armies across the horizon. The air had turned rough, the kind of turbulence that made overhead bins rattle and ice clink in half-empty glasses. Flight 237 rocked from side to side, drawing gasps from nervous travelers. Celeste Johnson sat perfectly still, her back straight, her eyes focused on the world beyond the window. The wings dipped, then steadied, but her pulse refused to follow. She could weather turbulence in the sky. It was the turbulence in the cabin that tightened her chest. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but none as frequent as those directed toward her. She could feel the weight of them pressing from every angle. Each sideways glance carried the same silent question. Is she the reason for this, as though her very presence could bend the weather itself? Linda Matthews appeared again, her face set in a performance of professional calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please keep your seatbelts fastened," she announced, voice just loud enough for first class. Yet her eyes slid toward Celeste like a blade slipping from its sheath. A woman across the aisle whispered to her husband, "That's her." She's the one the captain warned about. Celeste caught the words, felt them settle like stones in her stomach. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but she knew how easily defense could be twisted into defiance. Instead, she inhaled deeply and pressed her palms against her journal once more. Another jolt rattled the plane. Linda bent toward Celeste, her voice low and sharp. "Ma'am, passengers are uncomfortable. You need to remain absolutely still." Celeste blinked. She had not moved in nearly half an hour. She lifted her gaze to meet Linda's. "I have been still. I am not the turbulence." Linda's lips curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "We'll see what the captain says." She pivoted and disappeared toward the cockpit again. Celeste's heart pounded louder than the engines. She glanced around. Most passengers kept their heads down, choosing silence over solidarity. But Daniel Kim, 2 rows back, held his phone steady, eyes wide. He gave her the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement. "I see you. I see what's happening." The plane dipped sharply, drawing a chorus of yelps. Even Celeste's fingers tightened on the armrest. Yet her mind was less on the skies and more on the storm brewing inside this cabin. She thought of boardrooms where men twice her age questioned her authority. She thought of neighborhoods where patrol cars slowed when she walked by. She thought of the countless moments when dignity meant swallowing words, preserving calm while being cut by 1,000 small aggressions. Her mother's words returned again, steady as an anchor. "Storms come. Celeste, you don't have to fight every drop of rain, but you never let them drown you." The intercom crackled once more. Captain Green's voice boomed, deeper now, tinged with irritation. "For the safety of this flight, we expect all passengers to cooperate fully with crew instructions. Failure to do so will result in removal and further action once we land in New York." The message was general, but every eye in first class swiveled toward Celeste. She sat motionless, jaw set, refusing to give the narrative oxygen. The turbulence outside eased briefly, the clouds parting just enough to reveal a slice of blue sky. Yet the tension within the cabin did not lift. It thickened. The silver-haired man in 2A cleared his throat. "Maybe you should, just try not to draw attention," he muttered. Celeste turned slowly to him. "I haven't spoken, I haven't moved, and still I am accused." Her voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of generations. "Tell me, sir, what more should I erase to be left in peace?" He shifted uncomfortably, unable to answer. The silence stretched until the plane jolted again, trays rattling, cups spilling droplets of water. A child cried in economy, muffled by a parent's shushing. Celeste pressed her journal open, her pen gliding across the page, though her hands trembled slightly. She wrote, "Not for the record, but for survival. They try to make me the storm, but I am the sky, and skies endure." Linda returned, this time not alone. Another flight attendant followed, younger, his expression uncertain. Linda gestured toward Celeste with an exaggerated sigh. "She's been agitated, moving during turbulence. Other passengers feel unsafe." The younger attendant glanced at Celeste, his brow furrowing. "Ma'am." "Have you?" Celeste cut him off, her voice calm but firm. "I have sat here quietly the entire flight. Your colleague's account is false." The young man hesitated, then looked back at Linda. Her eyes narrowed, daring him to contradict her. He said nothing, retreating toward the galley. Linda leaned down, whispering so only Celeste could hear. "You can make this easier for yourself. Stop resisting." Celeste met her gaze without flinching. "I am resisting nothing except your story." Linda straightened, lips pressed thin, and marched away. Daniel Kim's phone caught every word. His hands shook, but he kept recording. He knew this was no longer just turbulence. This was history repeating itself inside a cabin flying 30,000 feet above the ground. Another bump shook the plane, but Celeste hardly noticed. The true storm raged inside her chest. Her thoughts wrestled between fury and restraint, between the instinct to fight and the discipline to endure. She imagined standing, raising her voice, demanding witnesses. Yet she knew how that would be read: aggressive, unstable, threatening. Labels ready to be stamped on her skin before she could even land. So she stayed seated, silent, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. But inside, her resolve hardened. She would not let this end the way so many stories had ended before. The clouds outside thickened again, lightning flickering faintly in the distance. Passengers gasped as the plane lurched downward for a breathless second. Oxygen masks did not drop, but the fear was real. People clutched hands, muttered prayers, and still, somehow, eyes turned toward Celeste, as though she had summoned the storm, as though the captain's words had made her the scapegoat for the sky. Celeste closed her eyes. She let the roar of the engines fill her ears, drowning out whispers, accusations, silence. And in that roar, she heard something else, her own voice, steady and unbroken. Not this time, not again. When we land, the storm will answer to me. The plane steadied once more, gliding through a pocket of calm. But Celeste knew better than to believe the worst was behind her. The real turbulence had only begun. When the cockpit door opened again, the hush that fell over the first-class cabin was sharp enough to sting. Captain Thomas Green stepped out, shoulders squared, eyes carrying the full weight of authority. He didn't scan the cabin this time. He walked directly toward Celeste Johnson. "Ma'am," his voice boomed, firm enough for every passenger within earshot. "I have multiple complaints about your behavior. You've been disruptive, ignoring instructions, and disturbing the cabin." The words struck like a hammer. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Forks clinked against plates. Even the businessman across the aisle paused his phone call, lowering the device as if savoring the show. Celeste blinked slowly, letting the accusation settle before responding. Her voice, when it came, was measured, calm. "Captain, I have done nothing of the sort. I've been seated quietly for the duration of this flight." But the captain pressed on, his tone carrying that dangerous edge of certainty. "The crew has informed me otherwise, and I've witnessed enough myself. We cannot have passengers compromising safety." A murmur spread across the rows. Some passengers leaned in for a better look, their curiosity outweighing discretion. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. The silver-haired man in 2A cleared his throat as though rehearsing courage, then faltered, sinking back into his seat. Linda Matthews hovered behind the captain, her arms folded, expression fixed in righteous satisfaction. She didn't need to say anything. Her posture declared she had already won. Celeste could feel her pulse quickening, yet her outward composure never cracked. "Captain Green," she said softly, with respect, "I am not the problem here. I have followed every instruction. The turbulence you feel is from the sky, not from me." Her words hung, but the captain's face remained impassive. "We'll be making a note of your conduct. You may be escorted off this flight when we land in New York." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The accusation had moved from whispered suspicion to official condemnation. Celeste's very dignity had been put on public trial at 30,000 feet. Daniel Kim's phone trembled in his hands as he continued to film. He knew the gravity of what was unfolding, that this was not just an uncomfortable moment, but a story of injustice being written in real time. Celeste's eyes swept the cabin, searching for a flicker of support. passengers avoided her gaze, retreating into magazines, phones, or the safety of silence. The businessman smirked openly now, leaning back as though he had predicted this all along. She looked back to the captain. "You have made up your mind before hearing me. That is not justice. That is prejudice." The words were quiet but carried like a bell in the tense air. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even Linda's confident expression wavered, just for an instant. The captain's jaw tightened. "My responsibility is to this aircraft and everyone aboard. If you cannot comply, you will face consequences." Celeste folded her hands neatly on her journal, the leather cool beneath her palms. She did not raise her voice, did not plead. Instead, she spoke with the dignity of someone who had faced this trial in 100 different forms. "I am sitting in my rightful seat. I will not move." The silence that followed was deafening. The engines roared beneath them. But inside the cabin, it was as though the air itself held its breath. A child whimpered in economy, distant but piercing. Someone coughed. And then, as if the moment could bear no more weight, the captain turned sharply and strode back into the cockpit, the door locking once again with a metallic click. Linda lingered only long enough to give Celeste one last sharp look before following. Celeste's chest ached with the pressure of restraint. She wanted to shout, to demand justice right there, but she knew the trap. Anger would be twisted into proof of guilt. Defiance would be labeled aggression. So she sat, still as stone, yet inside, storms clashed louder than any thunder outside. Daniel's voice finally broke the silence, tentative but clear. I saw everything. You didn't do anything wrong." His words weren't loud enough to challenge the narrative fully, but they were enough for Celeste to hear. She turned her head, meeting his gaze across the rows. The kindness in his eyes steadied her. "Thank you," she whispered, almost inaudible. Another passenger shifted in her seat, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses. She looked as though she wanted to speak, lips parting, then closing again. Fear sealed her silence. The turbulence outside grew rougher, rattling trays and cups. The irony wasn't lost on Celeste. While the storm outside demanded their unity, the storm inside had divided them all. She reached for her pen and wrote across the page, "Accused for nothing, condemned without cause. But silence will not own the ending." The silver-haired man beside her shifted again, guilt pressing down on him. I should say something," he muttered, almost to himself. His eyes darted nervously toward the galley. "But it won't matter. They won't listen." Celeste turned to him, her expression steady. "Silence always matters. It tells them they are right. It tells them I am alone." He swallowed, eyes falling to his lap. The businessman smirked louder, now speaking into his phone as if narrating for an unseen audience. "Yeah, it's her. Some people just can't behave, causing trouble at 30,000 feet. His voice carried enough for everyone nearby to hear. Celeste closed her eyes, steadying her breath. Each word stung, but she would not yield. Her dignity was not theirs to strip. Daniel's camera captured it all: the captain's accusation, the silence of witnesses, the cruel satisfaction of those who believed the worst without proof. Every second was being preserved, though no one yet knew how powerful it would become. As the turbulence rattled once more, Celeste lifted her pen and wrote another line. "They want me small, but storms do not shrink. They break the sky open." The flight pressed onward, mile by mile toward New York. And though Celeste remained seated, still silent, she knew something had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer merely enduring turbulence. She was carrying the weight of a storm that once unleashed, would not be ignored. The cabin settled into a strange quiet after Captain Green's public accusation. It wasn't the calm of peace, but the hush of tension, the kind that lingers when everyone knows something is wrong but chooses to pretend otherwise. The hum of engines filled the void, steady and relentless, masking the weight of unspoken words. Celeste Johnson sat unmoving, her hands folded neatly on her journal. Her heart beat a steady drum against her ribs, but her face remained serene. She had long mastered the art of calm in the face of storms, yet she could feel the shift around her. The passengers had heard the captain's words, and though some had doubts, most had already judged. The accusation had done its work. A few glanced at her with suspicion, others avoided looking at her at all, as if eye contact might draw them into danger. The businessman across the aisle leaned back in his seat, smirk still plastered across his face. "Unbelievable," he muttered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Some people just can't follow simple rules." Celeste closed her eyes briefly, letting his words wash over her. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Beside her, the silver-haired man in 2A shifted uncomfortably. He had said nothing during the captain's confrontation, and his silence weighed heavy. Celeste could almost hear his thoughts turning over. He knew she had been calm. He knew she had done nothing wrong. But still he said nothing. The young mother, 2 rows behind, clutched her daughter tighter, whispering in the child's ear. Celeste couldn't hear the words, but she knew the message. The mother's eyes flicked toward her, then quickly away. The silence of the cabin pressed harder than the turbulence. It was the silence Celeste knew too well, the silence of people who believed in justice but chose comfort instead of courage. She opened her journal and wrote a single line. "The silence around me screams louder than the accusations." Daniel Kim's phone was still steady, though his hands trembled. His throat was tight, his chest heavy with fear. He wanted to shout the truth, to stand up and defend her, but he was 22, a college student, no authority, no voice that would be believed. He told himself the recording would be enough, that maybe later justice would hear it. Still, guilt gnawed at him for saying nothing now. Another pocket of turbulence shook the plane, eliciting gasps and nervous laughter. Linda Matthews reappeared, calm but cold, her eyes scanning the cabin before resting on Celeste again. "Ma'am," Linda said pointedly, "the captain has expressed concern. Please remain absolutely still until further notice." Celeste looked up at her, voice level. "I have remained still, but your story keeps moving." Linda's lips tightened, but she turned on her heel without replying. Celeste's chest ached not from fear, but from the loneliness of truth ignored. She thought of board meetings where she was the only woman of color at the table, where her ideas were dismissed until echoed by someone else. She thought of grocery store aisles where strangers clutched their purses tighter as she passed. She thought of the 1,000 ways silence had always been an accomplice to injustice. The silver-haired man finally broke, his voice low and strained. "I know you haven't done anything wrong," he muttered, "but if I say something, if I contradict the captain..." His words trailed into the hum of the engine. Celeste turned her head, meeting his eyes. "Your silence tells them they're right. It tells them I'm alone." He flinched, guilt flooding his features, but still he said nothing more. Daniel's camera caught it all, the cowardice, the complicity, the cost of silence. Celeste leaned back against her seat, staring at the ceiling lights, glowing faintly above. A scripture her grandmother once whispered came to mind, "Even the stones will cry out." She wondered how many more stones had to cry before people would. The turbulence outside grew stronger, but she barely felt it. Her storm was within. Minutes stretched like hours. Passengers sipped drinks nervously, whispered to one another, scrolled through phones with feigned focus. The accusation had poisoned the air, turning every glance into suspicion, every silence into judgment. The businessman chuckled again, shaking his head, causing all this mess at 30,000 feet. They should have known better than to let her on board. Celeste's throat tightened, but she refused to speak. Dignity, she reminded herself. Dignity above all. A faint beep sounded as a flight attendant's announcement crackled over the intercom, reminding passengers that the cockpit would remain closed due to turbulence. Celeste noted the irony: doors locked, voices silenced, judgment sealed. Her pen moved across the journal again. They want my silence to mean guilt, but silence can hold truth too, waiting for its hour. The silver-haired man shifted once more. His eyes glistened slightly, as though shame had seeped deep. He leaned toward Celeste, whispering hoarsely, "I should have spoken earlier. I'm sorry." Celeste's gaze softened, though her words were firm. Sorry means little if it never finds a voice. He swallowed, retreating back into his seat. The mother with the child kept her head down, stroking her daughter's hair. She, too, stayed quiet. It struck Celeste then how the cabin was a mirror of the world. Those who mocked, those who silenced, those who wanted to help but didn't, and the few who quietly resisted in secret. She felt a pang of weariness, but also a flicker of resolve. They could stay silent now, but the truth had witnesses, even if only one young man with a phone. The plane jolted sharply, drawing cries and curses. Celeste gripped the armrest, breathing steadily through the drop. When the aircraft leveled again, her heart was racing, but her resolve was steel. She pressed her pen harder to the page. Let them silence themselves. My voice will come after landing, for the rest of the flight. The cabin remained heavy with unspoken tension. Celeste stared out the window, the endless sky stretching beyond, reminding her of freedom that no accusation could cage. And though no one around her spoke the truth aloud, Celeste knew this storm would not end at touchdown. This silence, this complicity, it would echo far beyond the cabin of Flight 237. The flight dragged on in strained silence, every second stretched thin by the weight of judgment hanging in the cabin. Celeste Johnson sat with her journal closed now, her fingers resting on its cover as if the leather-bound book were both shield and anchor. She had written enough for the moment. The rest would be lived, not penned. The seatbelt sign dinged softly overhead as the turbulence subsided. Still, the tension did not lift. A voice cracked over the intercom. Captain Thomas Green. His tone was clipped, formal, and heavy with authority. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of an ongoing passenger disturbance. For your safety, we are taking appropriate measures. Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate. Celeste exhaled slowly. Disturbance. The word was calculated, chosen to frame her without naming her. The passengers shifted, some whispering, some tightening their belts as though preparing for an invisible threat. She straightened in her seat, eyes fixed ahead. They've written the story already, she thought. All that's left is to play their villain. Linda Matthews appeared again, her expression rehearsed, her posture stiff with self-righteousness. She leaned close to Celeste, voice low but sharp. "Ma'am, you'll need to disembark with security when we land. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Celeste's eyes met hers, calm, steady. "I've made nothing hard. That's your story, not mine." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said no more. She moved down the aisle, whispering to the businessman who had mocked Celeste earlier. He chuckled loudly, shaking his head, eager to play audience to the drama. Daniel Kim's phone was still running, hidden beneath his tray table. His stomach churned. He knew what was happening, knew it was wrong. He wanted to stand and shout, "She did nothing. She's innocent." But the sight of Linda's smirk and the authority of Captain Green's voice kept him pinned in his seat. Celeste, sensing his quiet struggle, glanced his way. Their eyes met briefly. She gave the faintest nod, a silent assurance that he was doing enough just by witnessing. The descent began, the hum of engines lowering pitch as the plane angled toward the runway. Passengers adjusted their belongings, the rituals of landing proceeding as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Yet everyone knew something was. The businessman across the aisle leaned over toward another passenger. "They'll drag her off. You'll see. Should have kept to her lane." His words oozed satisfaction, as if her humiliation were his entertainment. Celeste refused to look at him. She turned instead to the window, watching the ground rise to meet them. The city sprawled below, lights flickering like stars scattered on earth. Somewhere in those lights, truth waited. The landing was rough, tires squealing against asphalt, the cabin jerking forward as the brakes bit hard. A collective exhale filled the air. Passengers relieved the turbulence was behind them. But for Celeste, the true storm was only beginning. As the plane taxied to the gate, Linda reappeared, her voice artificially sweet, as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience, for your safety. We ask that you remain seated as we address a matter at the front of the aircraft." Every head turned, every eye drifted, inevitably, toward Celeste. She felt their gazes like heat on her skin. The aircraft door hissed open at the gate. Two uniformed security officers stepped inside, their presence heavy with authority. The cabin grew hushed, anticipation thick in the air. Captain Green emerged from the cockpit to meet them. His voice was calm, almost smug. "This is the passenger in question." He pointed directly at Celeste, his finger steady, unflinching. The officers approached her row. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." Celeste's chest rose with a deep breath. She placed her journal carefully in her bag, rose with unhurried grace, and adjusted the lapel of her blazer. Every movement deliberate, dignity intact. Her voice, when it came, was even and clear. "I'll walk with you, but I want it noted that I complied with every rule of this flight. I want it noted that this accusation is false." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flickered with something uncertainty, perhaps even doubt, but he said nothing. The businessman smirked wide, muttering just loud enough for Celeste to hear. Finally, she ignored him. As Celeste stepped into the aisle, a ripple of whispers passed through the cabin. Some passengers avoided her gaze, others stared openly, curiosity outweighing compassion. The young mother clutched her child tighter. The silver-haired man in 2A lowered his head, shame etched in his features. He had said nothing, and now silence chained him. Daniel Kim's hand trembled as he filmed. He whispered under his breath, words only the recording would catch. "She did nothing. This isn't right. This isn't right." Celeste's heels clicked softly against the floor as she walked toward the exit. Her chin was high, her steps steady. If they wanted her to leave in shame, they would be disappointed. At the doorway, Captain Green's voice followed her. "I hope you understand, ma'am. It's just protocol." Celeste paused, turning slightly. Her eyes locked on his. Calm, firm. "No, it's prejudice wrapped in protocol, and you'll be hearing from me." A murmur swept through the cabin, faint but audible. Even some who had remained silent shifted uneasily at her words. The security officers led her into the jet bridge, away from the rows of watching eyes. The air was cooler here, quieter, but the weight of humiliation still pressed against her chest. Yet beneath it, Something else stirred. Resolve. Every word spoken against her, every silence that enabled it, every smirk and whisper she carried them now, not as burdens, but as fuel. This moment would not break her. It would ignite her. Daniel watched her disappear through the door, his phone still recording the stunned silence left behind. He knew the world outside needed to see this, needed to hear her calm defiance against the captain's smug dismissal. On the jet bridge, Celeste inhaled deeply, the sterile airport air sharp in her lungs. She squared her shoulders, her mind already shifting gears. She had been accused, humiliated, paraded before strangers as a threat, but she was not broken. And when the world heard what truly happened on Flight 237, it would not be her dignity in question, it would be theirs. The jet bridge stretched long and sterile, its metallic walls echoing each step as Celeste Johnson walked between the two security officers. Their presence was firm, but not aggressive. They were simply following orders. Still, the humiliation pressed against her chest like a weight she refused to bow under. The air of the terminal hit her dry, cool, filled with the faint hum of announcements and rolling suitcases. The gate area buzzed with arriving passengers, but as the officers escorted her out, the chatter slowed. People noticed. Heads turned. Phones lifted. It was a spectacle now. Celeste held her posture tall, her blazer neat, her chin raised. Dignity is a choice, she whispered to herself. She would not allow them to script her ending. At the gate desk, a supervisor waited a woman in her 40s with a clipped bun and a badge that read, Margaret Doyle, Customer Operations Manager. She wore the kind of corporate smile that stretched without warmth, the kind trained in seminars to soothe while evading accountability. Ms. Johnson, Doyle began, her voice firm but polite. Thank you for cooperating. We've had a report of a passenger disturbance. For safety reasons, the captain has requested that you be removed from this flight. Celeste regarded her with calm intensity. And what disturbance exactly did I cause? Ms. Doyle faltered only slightly, then recovered. The captain expressed concern that your movements during turbulence created unnecessary risk and contributed to passenger alarm. Passenger alarm, Celeste repeated softly, tasting the words. Do you mean the alarm stirred by the unfounded claims of one flight attendant and a captain who never left his cockpit? A murmur rippled through the nearby onlookers. Some passengers from the flight had followed into the terminal, curious, whispering, recording. Doyle's smile tightened. I understand you feel this is unfair, but we must prioritize the safety perception of all passengers. Celeste's eyes narrowed. Perception, not facts, not truth. Just perception. Tell me, Ms. Doyle, how many other passengers were escorted off today for sitting still in their seat? The supervisor hesitated. The officers shifted awkwardly, caught between duty and doubt. Daniel Kim appeared then, breathless, his phone still recording. He had followed at a distance, but now stepped closer. His voice trembled but rang out clear. She didn't do anything. I filmed it. She sat still the whole time. You're removing the wrong person. All eyes snapped toward him. The officers turned. Doyle's composure cracked for the first time. Celeste glanced at him, a quiet gratitude flickering in her gaze. For all his fear, he had chosen to speak at last. Doyle raised her hands, a gesture of control. Sir, please lower your voice. This is a sensitive matter. But Daniel didn't back down. No, you're humiliating her for nothing, and I have proof. He raised the phone higher. The world deserves to see this. A hush fell. Onlookers leaned in, recording from their own phones now. A crowd was forming, a circle of witnesses. Celeste stepped forward, her voice steady, carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding boardrooms. Ms. Doyle, this isn't just about me anymore. Every camera here is capturing how you treat your passengers, who you believe, and who you silence. Choose carefully what you say next. Doyle's throat worked as she searched for words. She glanced at the security officers, but neither moved. Their doubt was visible now, carved in their eyes. Finally, Doyle spoke, her voice strained. Ms. Johnson, I need to file an incident report. Perhaps we can discuss this in a private office. Celeste shook her head gently. No. Transparency thrives in the light, not behind closed doors. The businessman from earlier emerged from the jet bridge, his voice loud, mocking. Oh, come on. She made a scene up there. The captain was right. Celeste turned her gaze on him, calm but piercing. Sir, the only scene here is the one you're desperate to narrate because it feeds your prejudice, but truth doesn't need your permission. His smirk faltered. The crowd's murmurs swelled against him. Celeste looked back at Doyle. You see, Miss Doyle, silence is complicity, and I refuse silence. At that, Daniel stepped closer, holding his phone toward her. Would you like me to show them, ma'am? The video Celeste considered for a moment, then shook her head. Not here, not yet. Timing matters. Her restraint carried weight. It wasn't desperation to prove innocence, it was control. Control over the story they had tried to strip from her. Doyle's cheeks flushed. She fiddled with her badge, clearly flustered. Ms. Johnson, please, let's resolve this respectfully. Celeste leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice though the crowd strained to hear. Respect begins with truth. When you're ready to offer that, we'll speak. Until then, I'll be waiting for more than just an apology. She straightened, looked at the security officers, and said clearly, Am I under arrest? One officer shook his head quickly. No, ma'am. You're free to go. Then I'll go. She replied. With that, Celeste picked up her bag, adjusted her blazer once more, and walked away from the gate. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, every step measured, resonant. The crowd parted to let her through, some whispering admiration, others shame. Daniel hurried after her, clutching his phone like a lifeline. As she disappeared into the terminal, Doyle stood frozen, the weight of dozens of recording phones capturing her indecision. The narrative she thought she controlled had slipped through her fingers. Celeste walked on, the hum of the airport around her blending with the beat of her heart. Anger simmered beneath her calm, but so did clarity. She knew what she would do next. They thought they had silenced her with humiliation. They had only given her a louder stage, and soon the name Celeste Johnson would not be whispered as a passenger accused. It would be declared as the woman who refused to bow and who held the power to change everything. The next morning, the glass facade of Horizon Air's headquarters glimmered in the rising sun. The building, 40 stories of steel and reflective windows, had always symbolized corporate strength. Today, it would become the stage for a reckoning. Celeste Johnson's driver pulled up to the private entrance. She stepped out in a navy suit tailored to perfection, her journal tucked inside her leather bag. Her posture was tall, her expression unreadable, but her mind was sharp with purpose. The events of the flight had not broken her. They had crystallized her resolve. Inside the marble lobby, employees whispered as she passed. Some recognized her from the viral clips now spreading online. The calm black woman escorted off a plane for causing turbulence. The irony was not lost on them. At the elevator, Daniel Kim waited nervously, phone still in his hand like a shield. He had stayed up all night, uploading the footage, answering messages, watching views climb into the millions. The video was everywhere now, morning shows, blogs, social feeds. Public opinion was surging, demanding answers. "Ms. Johnson," Daniel said, voice trembling with a mixture of nerves and awe. They know you're coming." The board called an emergency session. Celeste nodded once. "Good. Let's not keep them waiting." The top-floor conference room was already tense when she entered. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, surrounded by men and women in dark suits. At the head sat Charles Whitford, chairman of the board, his silver tie glinting under the recessed lights. His reputation for charm under pressure was legendary, but even he looked unsettled this morning. Beside him sat Margaret Doyle, the operations manager from the gate, her bun tighter than ever, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. On the other side, Captain Thomas Green, uniform crisp, jaw clenched. Linda Matthews was there too, her arms folded, gaze darting nervously. The air thickened when Celeste took her seat at the far end of the table. She set her journal down gently, the gesture quiet but commanding. Whitford cleared his throat. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice." Celeste's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. "I didn't agree. I summoned this meeting." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Whitford leaned forward. "Let's be direct. The footage from Flight 237 has created a public relations situation. We regret what happened and are prepared to issue an apology." Celeste raised a hand, cutting him off with grace. "An apology won't be enough. This isn't about words. It's about systems." Green bristled. "With all due respect, ma'am, I made a call for the safety of the passengers." "Protocol dictated protocol," Celeste repeated, her voice like glass. "The word you hide behind when you cannot name your prejudice." Green flushed, but said nothing more. Daniel, seated quietly near the back, hit the record button on his phone again. He knew history was unfolding. Celeste opened her journal and slid a page across the table toward Whitford. "Section 14B of your corporate bylaws. Shareholders holding more than 15% can call an emergency review of executive conduct. I hold 22. The room fell silent. Doyle's eyes widened. Green blinked. Whitford's composure cracked, just for a moment. "Yes," Celeste continued, her voice steady. "I am not only your passenger, I am your largest private shareholder, and yesterday your employees humiliated me publicly, endangered your brand, and revealed the rot within your culture. Today, I'm here not as a victim, but as an owner." The words landed like thunder. Whitford tried to recover. "Ms. Johnson, surely we can find a path forward without." Celeste leaned in. Her tone sharpened. "The path forward begins with accountability. Captain Green, you accused me falsely, humiliated me before dozens of witnesses, and weaponized protocol to mask bias."
"You are hereby relieved of duty pending termination review." Green shot to his feet. "You can't. I can," Celeste interrupted, calm but lethal. "And I just did." The silence was deafening. Green's face burned crimson. He looked to Whitford for support, but none came. Slowly, stiffly, he sat back down. Celeste turned her gaze to Linda Matthews. "And you twisted perception, enforced lies, and treated a loyal customer with disdain. Effective immediately. You are terminated for gross misconduct." Linda's breath caught. She glanced around, desperate for someone to intervene, but the room offered only silence. Finally, Celeste looked at Doyle. "And you, Ms. Doyle, you stood in that terminal and tried to manage optics instead of truth. You sought to contain me, not to listen. You will step down as operations manager. Effective today, but unlike the others, you'll be reassigned.
I believe people can learn if they're willing. Doyle's eyes welled, shame pooling in them. She nodded faintly, relief and regret colliding in her chest. Celeste straightened in her chair, addressing the whole board. This company will not survive on empty apologies and half measures. The world is watching. And, as of this morning, Horizon Air will launch the Integrity Initiative independent audits of crew conduct, mandatory anti-bias training, transparent passenger advocacy channels, and a whistleblower protection line that reports directly to me. Gasps rippled across the table. Some board members exchanged looks, nervous, but not opposed. Whitford finally spoke, his voice lower, subdued. "Ms. Johnson, you've already drafted this plan." Celeste's eyes flicked to her journal. "I drafted it years ago, waiting for the moment you would prove you needed it." Daniel felt goosebumps rise on his arms. Her calm was terrifying, not loud, but absolute. Celeste closed her journal, her words final. "You mistook me for turbulence. I am not turbulence. I am the storm that clears the sky." The boardroom was silent, stunned, and in that silence, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. By the time Celeste Johnson left Horizon Air's headquarters that afternoon, the story had already become a national flashpoint. News trucks crowded the sidewalks, camera crews jostling for position, microphones thrust forward like weapons of urgency. Celeste stepped into the light with the same poise she had carried on the plane. The questions rained down instantly. "Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to have been escorted off your own airline's flight? Did the captain and crew know you were a shareholder? What message do you have for passengers of color who've faced similar treatment?" She raised a hand gently, commanding silence without force. Her voice, calm but resonant, carried across the crowd. "This is not just about one flight. This is about dignity, about who gets believed and who gets silenced. Yesterday, I was accused of causing turbulence, but the real turbulence is the bias we allow to fly unchecked in our skies." The crowd quieted, pens and cameras poised. "I want to be clear," Celeste continued. "This is not vengeance. It is accountability. And accountability must reach beyond individuals. It must reach systems. Horizon Air will reform, and I intend to make sure the entire industry follows." Her words rippled outward, carried live on television, shared across social feeds. Within hours, hashtags surged. Turbulence of bias. Celeste Johnson, dignity in the skies. Inside a cafe across town, two college students huddled over their phones, replaying Daniel Kim's video of the flight. She didn't even move. One whispered, "They just decided she was guilty." The other nodded, shaking her head. "I've been there, not on a plane, but in stores, at school. It's always the same look." At a suburban kitchen table, a retired couple watched the news. The husband frowned, muttering, "Protocols are there for a reason." His wife shot back, "Protocols?" She was sitting still. "You just don't want to see it." For the first time, he had no rebuttal. Across the country, conversations like these sparked awkward, heated, necessary. Meanwhile, at Horizon Air's PR office, staff scrambled. Charts of plunging customer sentiment glowed on screens. Calls from investors flooded in. Margaret Doyle sat stiffly in a smaller office, reassigned but still present, her phone buzzing with messages from colleagues. She replayed Celeste's words in her mind. Respect begins with truth. Linda Matthews stayed silent, her termination letter still fresh. Thomas Green raged privately, threatening lawsuits, but the board had already cut ties. The story had moved beyond them now, and Daniel, his phone buzzed nonstop with interview requests. He wasn't seeking fame, but he knew the video mattered. When a journalist asked him what drove him to record, his answer was simple: because silence is complicity. And I couldn't be silent anymore. Celeste, however, kept her focus forward. The next day, she appeared on a primetime news special. Seated across from a veteran anchor, she spoke with quiet force. Flying should be about safety, not suspicion. Yet, too often, passengers of color are treated as threats before they're treated as customers. This isn't just my story. It's the story of many who never had cameras to prove it. The anchor leaned forward. And what do you say to those who claim this was just an unfortunate misunderstanding? Celeste didn't flinch. A misunderstanding is when the wrong meal is served. This was humiliation built on prejudice, enforced through silence, justified by protocol. If we call that a misunderstanding, we've misunderstood the meaning of justice. The clip spread like wildfire. Editorials praised her clarity, while some critics bristled, insisting she exaggerated, but the tide of public opinion leaned firmly in her favor. Airline unions released statements acknowledging the need for better training. Civil rights groups seized the moment, citing her case as proof of systemic bias. Lawmakers began drafting inquiries. For Celeste, the storm was not a distraction, it was a tool. She convened a press conference at a hotel ballroom 3 days later. The room was packed with reporters, activists, business leaders, even politicians. Behind her, a banner read, "Integrity in the Skies," a national call to action. She spoke for 30 minutes, laying out a 5-point reform plan. 1. Independent bias audits of all major airlines. 2. Passenger advocacy offices with direct authority. 3. Transparent reporting of discrimination incidents. 4. Mandatory training on implicit bias and de-escalation. 5. Industry-wide accountability through federal oversight. Her closing words drew standing applause. The sky belongs to everyone. No turbulence of bias should shake us from our right to travel with dignity. Outside the ballroom, protesters gathered in solidarity, holding signs, "Keep dignity." Flying, bias isn't protocol. We stand with Celeste. The businessman from the flight saw himself dragged across headlines too. Viewers had identified him in Daniel's footage, his mocking words replayed endlessly. His company issued a statement distancing from his behavior, and soon his silence replaced his smugness. Meanwhile, Celeste's calm defiance became emblematic. Cartoons depicted her standing firm against storms, labeled bias. Talk shows invited her to speak. College campuses studied her as a case in leadership and grace under fire. But behind the spotlight, Celeste remained reflective. In her journal, she wrote late one night, "The storm outside is loud, but the quieter storm inside asks harder questions. Why does it take humiliation to spark change? Why must proof be filmed before truth is believed?" Her pen paused, then continued. Still, storms clear skies, and maybe, just maybe, this one will leave a horizon brighter than before. The media storm had lifted her story into the stratosphere, yet for Celeste, this was never about fame. It was about shifting an industry, changing a culture, and proving that dignity could not be grounded. The media frenzy might have satisfied some, but Celeste Johnson knew it was only the first stage. Public outrage was powerful, but outrage without structure faded quickly. If she wanted change to last, she needed something bigger than headlines. She needed a blueprint. 2 weeks after the incident, Celeste convened a private summit in Washington, D.C., in a hotel ballroom converted into a strategy chamber. The guest list was carefully curated civil rights leaders, aviation experts, lawmakers, labor representatives, and executives from rival airlines. Even a few skeptical regulators attended, wary but intrigued. Daniel Kim sat near the back, still adjusting to the surreal fact that he had gone from an ordinary college student to a recognized witness in a national conversation. His phone buzzed constantly with new messages, but for once, he kept it tucked away. He wasn't here to film, he was here to watch the future unfold. Celeste stood at the podium, her navy suit replaced by a softer charcoal gray, but her presence was as commanding as ever. She spoke not as a victim, but as an architect. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "the story of Flight 237 has been told. But if we stop at the story, then nothing changes. Stories stir emotion. Blueprints build futures. Today, I want to talk about futures." She clicked a remote, and a screen lit up behind her with the title, "The Integrity Blueprint for Aviation." She walked them through 5 pillars, each carefully detailed. First, independent oversight. Airlines cannot be left to police themselves. We propose a Federal Aviation Equity Commission independent investigators who review passenger complaints, audit crew conduct, and publish transparent data. No more burying misconduct in closed files. Second, passenger advocacy. Every airline will establish an advocate office with real authority. When a passenger feels targeted or mistreated, they will have a voice with power to intervene, not just a suggestion box buried in bureaucracy. Third, bias training with accountability. This is not about a 2-hour seminar with slides. This is about immersive, scenario-based training tied to performance reviews. Promotions and raises will depend not only on technical skill, but on equitable conduct. Fourth, transparent reporting. Quarterly public reports will disclose incidents of discrimination, responses taken, and disciplinary actions. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. The public deserves to know how their dignity is protected or violated. Fifth, industry collaboration. No one airline can do this alone. We propose an industry-wide task force, supported by unions, regulators, and passengers themselves, because dignity should not vary by carrier. The room was silent as she finished. Then, slowly, applause built, measured, thoughtful, but genuine. A congresswoman in the front row leaned forward. "Ms. Johnson, this is ambitious, but how do you plan to ensure airlines actually adopt it?" Celeste met her gaze. "The same way we ensure any system changes pressure, partnership, and persistence. Public outrage is on our side. Shareholder leverage is on our side. And if the industry resists, regulation will follow. The cost of inaction will outweigh the cost of reform." Whitford, the Horizon chairman, shifted in his seat at the side of the room. He had resisted Celeste's rise, but even he knew the tide had turned. Investors were already asking how Horizon would lead, not lag. Later that afternoon, breakout groups formed. Activists shared stories of passengers removed from flights for speaking their native languages or wearing religious clothing. Pilots and attendants confessed quietly to the pressure of keeping order, often being code for catering to biased complaints. Regulators scribbled notes, sensing momentum. Daniel found himself drawn into a small circle where attendees debated youth involvement. "You represent the next generation," one civil rights leader told him. "Your video shifted the narrative. Don't underestimate your role." He flushed, but Celeste noticed his unease from across the room. When the group dispersed, she approached him. "You're quiet today," she said softly. I don't know if I belong here." Daniel admitted. "I'm just a student with a phone." Celeste's smile was warm but firm. History has always turned on the voices of ordinary people who refused silence. You recorded truth when others looked away. That makes you part of this blueprint as much as anyone here. Daniel swallowed hard, nodding, a little steadier now. By evening, a draft resolution had been written, the Integrity Blueprint for Aviation Reform. Signatures filled the bottom lawmakers. activists, even rival airline executives willing to avoid the PR disasters Horizon now faced. Celeste read the document once more before adding her name. In her journal later, she wrote, "Blueprints are not built on paper alone. They are built in the courage to imagine and the persistence to enforce." The media quickly caught wind of the summit. Headlines declared Johnson unveils aviation reform plan and from humiliation to blueprint. How one flight sparked industry change. Not everyone cheered. Airline lobbyists bristled, calling it overreach. Anonymous op-eds accused Celeste of exploiting her ordeal for personal power. But the blueprint had momentum. Activists framed opposition as proof of why change was needed, and for passengers who had long carried silent wounds of bias in travel. Celeste's plan felt like vindication. Letters poured into her office, handwritten notes from elderly couples, emails from young professionals, drawings from children who had overheard their parents' stories. Each one ended with the same refrain, "Thank you for not staying silent." Celeste read them at night, sometimes with tears, sometimes with quiet fury at how deep the wounds ran, but always with renewed resolve. One evening, she sat by her hotel window, the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. She thought back to the silence of that airplane cabin, to the silver-haired man who had chosen comfort over courage, to the mother who clutched her child but never spoke. They, too, are part of this, she whispered to herself, because silence is what I'm fighting to break. And as she closed her journal, she knew the blueprint was more than a plan for airlines. It was a call to everyone, passengers, crews, bystanders, leaders, to choose dignity over silence. The storm had grown larger than one woman. It was now an industry reckoning, a societal mirror, and perhaps, if carried far enough, a new horizon for justice. The integrity blueprint spread like wildfire across news outlets and policy circles, but with every surge of momentum came pushback loud, organized, and determined. A week after the Washington summit, Celeste Johnson sat in her office overlooking the city skyline. Her desk was stacked with newspapers, some lauding her as a visionary reformer, others branding her a dangerous disruptor. Headlines clashed. Johnson brings accountability to the skies, beside CEO overreach, threatens industry stability. Charles Whitford had warned her this would happen. "You've moved faster than the industry can stomach," he'd said in a late-night call. But Celeste had replied evenly, "Justice doesn't wait for comfort." Now the backlash was materializing. Airline lobbyists launched a campaign painting her as power-hungry. Ads aired on cable news featuring smiling flight attendants, cheerful passengers, and the tagline, "Trust the skies, not politicians." The implication was clear. Celeste was politicizing travel. On talk radio, callers fumed. "She wants to punish good employees for one misunderstanding." A man ranted, "I'm tired of everyone playing the race card." Another chimed in, "This isn't about fairness, it's about control." Even online, the vitriol grew. Hashtags twisted cancel Celeste. Don't ground freedom. Anonymous accounts accused her of fabricating the incident, despite Daniel Kim's video. Some dragged her personal life into the mud, her divorce, her wealth, her position. Daniel felt the sting too. His inbox flooded with threats and insults. In class, strangers whispered about him. He sat with his phone clutched tight, scrolling through comments until his chest hurt. One night he texted Celeste, "Maybe I made things worse." She called him immediately. Her voice was calm, steady, even over the static of the line. "Daniel, storms always shake the weakest branches first, but storms also clear the air. Don't let their noise rewrite what you saw with your own eyes." Her words steadied him, though the fear lingered. Meanwhile, within Horizon Air, dissent brewed. A faction of executives argued that Celeste's reforms threatened profitability. They whispered in corners, drafted memos questioning her authority, and hinted at rallying shareholders against her. Whitford, though shaken, warned her of the growing discontent. At the same time, stories of resistance trickled in from crews. Some attendants rolled their eyes at the new training modules. A few pilots grumbled in private forums about being policed for doing their jobs. The culture she was trying to uproot showed its roots ran deep. The harshest blow came during a congressional hearing. Celeste sat before a panel of lawmakers, her blueprint under review. While some praised her clarity, one senator leaned forward, his tone dripping skepticism. "Ms. Johnson, critics say you're exaggerating one isolated event to force unnecessary federal oversight. Isn't this just a case of personal grievance being inflated into policy?" Celeste met his gaze, unflinching. "Senator, if it were isolated, the public wouldn't have flooded my office with thousands of stories echoing the same pattern. This isn't about grievance, it's about systemic bias that has been ignored for far too long. One flight revealed it. Millions live it." The room fell silent for a beat, but the senator smirked, satisfied he'd scored his point for cameras. Afterward, Celeste sat in her car, hands folded in her lap. For the first time in weeks, exhaustion hit her fully. She thought of her grandmother, who had marched decades earlier for civil rights, facing fire hoses and jeers. Backlash, she realized, was proof of progress, but it still hurt. That night, in her journal, she wrote, "Power never concedes quietly. They will call it grievance, overreach, control. But I know the truth. It is dignity, and dignity is not negotiable." The resistance wasn't only external. Some of those who had been silent on the plane resurfaced. The silver-haired man from seat 2A wrote an op-ed in a national paper, confessing his guilt. I stayed silent while a woman was humiliated before me. My comfort weighed more than her dignity. I regret it deeply. His admission went viral, sparking debates about bystander silence. The young mother with the child also came forward in a local TV interview. Tearfully, she said, "I was afraid to speak. I thought holding my daughter tight would keep us safe. But now I wonder, what lesson did I teach her?" Their confessions complicated the narrative. They were not villains, but mirrors showing the cost of silence, the weight of complicity. For Celeste, their voices mattered. Proof that the story was resonating, not just polarizing, but backlash reached its ugliest form one evening when protesters gathered outside Horizon headquarters. Some held signs reading, "Stop bias and fly with dignity." Others carried placards declaring no more overreach and keep government out of the skies. The clash was loud, messy, even dangerous. Police eventually separated the groups, but the message was clear. Celeste had split the nation's conscience wide open. Through it all, she remained steady in public. But in private, her doubts surfaced. Sitting alone in her penthouse, she stared at the city lights and whispered, "Am I building or breaking?" The answer came not from within, but from a letter she received the next day. It was written in shaky handwriting from an elderly man in Alabama. "I was a freedom rider in 1961. I know what it feels like to be dragged, mocked, silenced. When I saw you walk off that plane with your head high, I saw the same spirit. Don't let them break you. Storms mean you're on the right path." Celeste pressed the paper to her chest. The tears came not of defeat, but of release. The backlash was real, fierce, and unrelenting, but so was her purpose. And as the storm swirled around her, she resolved once more storms did not scare her. They shaped her. The storm did not last forever. Storms never do. 3 months after Flight 237, the energy around Celeste Johnson's integrity blueprint had shifted from chaos to consensus. What began as a scandal had transformed into an industry-wide reckoning. The final push came when 4 major airlines, facing shareholder pressure and customer boycotts, signed on publicly to the blueprint. Their statements admitted that bias, both conscious and unconscious, has no place in aviation. Smaller carriers followed suit. The dominoes fell not all willingly, but inevitably. Celeste stood at the podium of the National Aviation Summit in Washington, D.C. The cavernous hall filled with executives, regulators, advocacy leaders, and journalists. Cameras flashed, microphones bristled, her voice carried steady, deliberate. This is not about one flight, not about one woman. It is about every passenger who has been told, silently or aloud, that they do not belong. The blueprint is not perfect, but it is a beginning, and beginnings matter. Applause rose, not the thunder of unanimous approval, but the rumble of recognition. Even skeptics in the crowd could not deny the tide of history moving through the room. Daniel Kim watched from the front row, his phone forgotten in his pocket. For months he had wrestled with shame, fear, and pressure, but seeing Celeste command the stage, he felt lighter. She had carried not only her burden, but his too, transforming his shaky video into a spark for reform. Beside him, Charles Whitford leaned on his cane, his sharp eyes moist. He whispered, almost to himself, "I never thought I'd live to see this day." The summit ended with a signing ceremony. Airline leaders inked their commitments, their signatures captured live on national television. The ink symbolized not perfection, but accountability, an unerasable mark. That night, Celeste returned to her hotel suite, the city lights glowing beyond the window. Monica delivered a folder thick with letters, emails, and testimonials. "We've been inundated again," she said, "stories of passengers, staff, even executives. People saying this blueprint gave them permission to hope." Celeste opened the folder slowly, leafing through pages. One was from a young flight attendant. "I used to laugh at jokes I knew were wrong because silence felt safer. Now I speak up, and I don't feel alone." Another came from a father in Ohio. "My son was humiliated on a flight 2 years ago. No one cared. Seeing you fight makes me believe the world can change for him." Celeste closed the folder, her throat tight. She whispered softly, "This is why." But the journey was not without scars. The backlash had left her drained. Some friendships had frayed. Some investors had left. Even her health had faltered under the strain of endless travel and confrontation. Yet, as she reflected, she understood progress always exacts a price. The question was never whether she could avoid the cost, but whether the cost was worth paying. And she knew unequivocally that it was. Weeks later, back in Chicago, she attended a quiet ceremony at Horizon's headquarters. In the lobby, a new installation was unveiled, a wall engraved with the words, "Dignity is non-negotiable." Beneath it, screens displayed anonymized passenger stories, rotating testimonies that ensured no one could forget why change was needed. Employees stood gathered, some in crisp uniforms, others in business suits. Celeste addressed them briefly. "This wall is not for me," she said, "and it is not for Horizon alone. It is for every person who has ever been silenced. Let it remind us daily that silence is complicity and dignity is action." Tears glistened in more eyes than one. Months later, Celeste's blueprint had inspired new legislation requiring airlines to report incidents of discrimination, to maintain independent review boards, and to implement transparent accountability systems. The law was not flawless, but it carried her imprint, justice codified, dignity written into policy. At her townhouse one evening, Celeste sat in her favorite armchair, her grandmother's quilt draped across her lap. She wrote in her journal, "The turbulence was never in the sky. It was in the hearts of people unwilling to see." But turbulence teaches us to hold steady, to endure, to adjust. And sometimes turbulence leads us to clearer air. Daniel visited that weekend. He brought news of his acceptance to graduate school, inspired by the movement he had witnessed. "I want to study public policy," he told her shyly. "Maybe even aviation reform." "Your fight changed me." Celeste smiled, pride flickering across her face. "Then it was never just my fight, was it?" He shook his head. "No, it's all of ours." Spring came, and with it, new beginnings. At O'Hare International Airport, Celeste boarded a flight not as a CEO on a mission, but as a passenger once more. She settled into her seat, a quiet sense of déjà vu washing over her. The hum of engines, the shuffle of passengers, the familiar dance of departure. This time, though, the cabin felt different. Attendants greeted her warmly, respectfully. Passengers smiled without suspicion. When turbulence rattled the plane briefly, no one turned to look at her. She sipped her water, gazing out at the horizon. The sky stretched wide, infinite, unbound. For the first time since Flight 237, Celeste felt peace in the air. She reached for her journal and wrote a single line. "Sometimes the storm you endure becomes the calm others inherit." The woman who had once been accused of causing turbulence had become the architect of smoother skies for herself, for others, for generations yet to come. And as the aircraft leveled into steady flight, Celeste Johnson closed her eyes, her heart steady. The turbulence was over. The journey continued. Celeste's story is not only about airplanes and policies, it is about the storms we all face in our lives. Sometimes, the turbulence does not come from the sky, but from the judgments, biases, and silences of those around us. Her courage reminds us that dignity is not something we ask for, it is something we claim, quietly but firmly, even when others deny it. For older audiences who have seen decades of change, the lesson resonates deeply. Progress has always demanded endurance, and silence has always carried a cost. Celeste's refusal to shrink became a mirror for us all. How many times have we accepted mistreatment just to keep the peace? How often have we stayed silent when speaking up might have changed everything? The story shows that one person's stand can ripple outward, sparking reforms that touch thousands. And it teaches us something profound. The storms in our lives may bruise us, but they can also become the very winds that lift others higher. Dignity, once defended, is a gift that keeps traveling forward, just like Celeste's legacy in the skies. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If Celeste's story touched you, please give this video a like, share it with friends or family, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling powerful stories that remind us all of the strength, dignity, and hope we carry within.